Hello, everyone. I forget which session this is and didn't check, but right now we're going to analyze chapter 19, which concerns time. So just to get right into the text, the commentary starts off immediately by saying, any account of the ultimate nature of reality must include something concerning the status of time. So this makes sense, of course. Any ultimate account of reality should include time in order to be, encompassing and totalizing in its account. And so we're presented with two possibilities for understanding time on this ultimate level. Either time itself is ultimately real, or time is a mere convention, which is based on things which serve as ultimate foundations for time. So either time is ultimately real or time is based on something which is ultimately real. And these two ways of understanding time is going to be analyzed by Nāgārjuna and basically refuted. Let's see. So we can go straight to the text, the verses, and
wait, really
read.
fast.
Yes.
Can I? So one thing that's kind of weird about these verses is that all of the first 5 verses are dealing with why time must be unreal on a view under which the 3 times are interdependent, but the view of the 3 times being independently existent, not interdependent, just isn't dealt with at all. Like it's ignored entirely. Perhaps just because Nāgārjuna thought it was obviously nonsensical that the future could just be it's an independently existent thing, independent of the past and present, and vice versa.
But
That's kind of
I
like a
actually
weird thing
assumed
that doesn't come up. It starts from it starts from the dependence thesis as the thesis of dependence, as Sideritz and Katsura call it. It starts with showing why time would be unreal under that thesis, where time is real and exists as an interdependence of past, present, and future, rather than even considering the idea that time is real and the 3 times exist independently of one another. It's just entirely ignored.
What about verse 3 though? I feel like I thought that's what verse 3 was doing.
Yeah, but I guess I was misunderstanding. I was thinking of verse 3. Oh, okay, I see now. Reading the commentary, that makes sense. Okay, yes, that's the same one that Buddhapalita gives as framing. I see. Okay, so yes, that's true. Then verse 3 does go into that. Okay, my mistake. I was kind of misinterpreting that. I was thinking of verse 3 as just an extension of verse 2, still within the interdependence thesis, saying that they are unestablished.
Yeah, it's a slightly elusive.
Yeah, for the same reason as in verse 2.
Yeah, it was slightly elusive because they didn't really go into it in the way that they went to the dependence relations. But
okay. I see. Yes, you're right. That is what verse 3 is doing.
Yeah, so if we can read verse 1 and 2 together because they basically go together. Verse 1 is, if the present and the future exist dependent on the past, then present and future would be at a past time. Verse 2, if, moreover, present and future do not exist there, then how would present and future exist dependent on that? So this basically, the argument here basically assumes that for a dependence relation to hold, the relata that are being related to one another have to exist in the same time. If they don't exist in the same time, then it doesn't make sense for them to be in a relationship with one another.
Yeah. I think this is what's interesting about this is like what if you proposed, I feel like some might propose, okay, in some like Western metaphysics, there are sometimes notions of hypertime, which is basically like what if you were a temporal being but saw all of time at once. What would your time be? Well, it would be hypertime In other words, it would be like how if you imagine like if you imagine we made like a simulated universe that had a start point and an end point, and like had videos of different things in the universe, and we could like scroll on the like slider at the bottom of the video, we would be doing that scrolling in time, in our time, but then there would be like a time that's happening in the simulated universe,
Right.
which is what we're sort of looking at from hypertime. And I this has been proposed sometimes to talk about like why, for example, you could avoid certain kinds of paradoxes associated with time travel in like metaphysics of time. It's been talked about in theology to talk about how, like, in what sense God could both like have creative activity in the world and also be atemporal, is because he's actually temporal, but he's hypertemporal and atemporal and like not involved in regular time. But I wonder what Nāgārjuna would say with this argument, because if the argument is that, you know, there can't be this dependence relation unless they both exist at the same time, well, the hypertime theorist might be like, well, that's not actually true, because the dependence relation can be instantiated in hypertime.
Mm-hmm. But I feel like, what if Nāgārjuna responds, okay, if the hyper present and the hyper future exist dependent on the hyper past, then hyper present and hyper future would be at the hyper past time.
Right, exactly.
Like,
I think that you know, you could say this, but then we'd have to ask the exact same question about hypertime.
yeah.
Because surely whatever like God's eye view, whoever has the God's eye view and is hypertemporally experiencing their perception of the dependence relation between normal past, present, and future, likewise is experiencing that in a succession of past, present, and future experiences, with, you know, and would say of themselves, oh yes, 5 hyper minutes ago, I noticed that there's a dependence relation between the past and the present and the future. Well, that means that there was a hyper past, and you're now in the hyper present, and there's going to be a hyper future. What's the relationship between those things?
Right. And I feel like my intuition is that if you try to resolve that the sort of the 3 hyper times into sort of one condensed thing, so you don't like kind of repeat the same issue, then this sort of begs the question as to why couldn't you do that with normal time? You know, if you're going to do that with hypertime, like
and
making.
Also, if you were to do that in hypertime, it kind of gets rid of the. Well, maybe this is what you're saying, but how do you even get what you're trying to get by proposing hypertime in this case is to explain where, so to speak, or like in what time, so to speak, the dependence relation between past and between, you know, past and then the future and the present is instantiated. But if you're then collapsing hypertime into this timeless thing where there's no division of past, present, and future, then that very same dependence relation can't actually instantiate there, because then it's not actually true that at the same hypertime,
Right.
both past and present and future exist, because there isn't a same hypertime, because there's no, you know,
there's no time slot in hypertime.
Yeah, exactly. There's no time slice in the hypertime. There's no hypertime. There are no points in hypertime at which they can both exist.
I mean, this is the funny sort of tactic that Madhyamaka is sort of just be like, okay, like your present conceptual doesn't work. How about this one? And the other person's like, oh, actually, yeah, I agree with that. And then you just go around and say, well, even that one doesn't work. Because they sort of lure the opponent to try to realize that, yeah, every time they try to save their own position, they actually sort of start digging their own grave. And this actually made me think about how would hypertime now be distinguished from, let's say, a concept I'm not fully understanding of, but this idea of a 4th time beyond the 3 times within Buddhism as I think as like the space of the Dharmakaya, right? So it's like the time outside the 3 times. Have you heard of that before?
Yes, I have heard of 4th time. So fourth time is like a thing that, as I understand it, comes up more specifically in Dzogchen,
Mhm.
which I am less familiar with, I think. Um,
Yeah, I'm
it-
slowly
but
trying to
basically,
understand.
so it's Longchenpa basically is the one who brings up fourth time or like the four times in a more clear way. Um, and as I understand it, the fourth time isn't like a time in the sense that like temporal stuff exists at particular points of
Right.
it, right? Like I don't think that it
I
has
mean, I
the
wonder if it's like,
it doesn't have the getting laterness of
right.
normal time to it.
I mean, it almost sounds, I mean, in a way, it almost sounds like it'd be sort of, um, in a weird way, identical with Rigpa in the sense that it's the sort of the transcendental condition that makes it possible to abstract time, to abstract the sort of continuation, the transitory character of moments of time. So in a sense, it's not devoid of a temporal character, but
So
at the
again,
same time, it's not itself a time.
I
So,
found the Longchenpa citation. So what
oh,
Longchenpa says, uh so the three times and timeless time is Samantabhadra's time. I think he means Samantabhadra Buddha here. And it is the originally accomplished and changeless state. So the fourth time is called variously in Longchenpa's works no time, time without time, Samantabhadra's time, the state of Samantabhadra. Um, and Samantabhadra is just the symbol of the Dharmakaya. And then to introduce the four times, Longchenpa starts with the experience of the three times. He says, past has ceased, future has not yet come to existence, present does not linger, it is neither within nor anywhere else, know it to be like the sky, immune to propositions about it. Um, and then he says, then um, it is not in the has been, nor is it on the side of the not yet. It is not in a now, but is a state naturally remaining identical with itself. Instead of seeking mind by mind, let be. This self existing pristine consciousness, evoked through the Guru's sustaining power, is seen when words and thoughts and talk have passed away. To see it then as time is the moment when the three aspects of time are no time, and a before or a later can no longer be distinguished. It is called Prajnaparamita Madhyamika. Uh,
yeah, so it sounds like the sort of,
Calming the rush of propositions and suffering, the great seal, the great perfection, very meaningful, the meaningfulness of meaningfulness.
okay, so I think I seem to get that sense. Yeah, so it's sort of like the condition of all conceptualizations. Um, that's sort of not
Absent, absent those conceptualizations.
right.
So
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
the
but also not devoid of the potential to give rise to them
so in an
as
odd way,
conceptions.
it actually is like what you were saying of like collapsing the timiness of hypertime. So it's still hyper in that it's pre-time, but then we're not temporalizing the hypertime. So it's
Right,
just it's hyper non-time.
right,
It's
yeah.
like empty hyper time.
Yes, empty hypertime.
Yeah, it's
Exactly.
like it's like the moment when you recognize the non-arising of the three times, that's the fourth time.
Yeah, the moment when
Right.
we
But
recognize.
and that moment in its own experience is timeless, right? Because it's the getting rid of all
So it's not.
proliferations.
So in other words,
Or
then
not even
from
timeless.
its
I mean,
own, so from its own perspective, so to speak, it isn't really a perspective, but you know, from its nature, actually, which is non-diluted, it's not even a moment. We're speaking of it as being a
right,
moment out of ignorance
right.
because it seems that way to us, but it actually isn't a moment from its own I guess.
Right. I mean, it's the same problem Longchenpa has when he says the time beyond time. It's just like, it's hard to talk about it without doing these paradoxes.
Yeah. Okay, well, fourth time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good topic to go over. So yeah, so verse 1 and 2 refute the dependence of any pair on another, any pair on the third aspect, because we're assuming that a dependence relation only holds when the things are together at the same time. And I think it's not just that, but it also seems like the problem is, let's see. Yeah, I mean, even if we say that they do exist dependent on, so if present and future do exist dependent on the past, this sort of just undermines their identity as like being present and future if they're in the past. Actually, no, I think that's the same point. Anyway, we can move on to verse 3. There is no establishment of the two, moreover, if they are independent of the past. Therefore, neither present nor future time exists. And so here, so the commentary actually gives a little bit of Buddhapalita's understanding of this verse. And according to Buddhapalita, to reject the thesis of independence is to say that the grounds for this, I'm misreading it. The grounds for this rejection are that if, say, the future existed by itself, then where it existed would always be the future and never the present or the past. So this is basically saying that if any of the three times are independent of one another, then we don't actually have a way to experience the transitory character of time, by which the present moves into the past and the future comes into the present. I mean, that's our experience of time, and that's what we're sort of analyzing. And one of the things this made me think of, which is sort of relevant to the whole text, is that a lot of the things that pretty much all the things that we're analyzing and refuting are actual experiences of them, rather than some kind of hypothetical philosophical conceptualization. So we're refuting our actual experience of time, not any particular version of some kind of conceptual idea of what time is. Same thing with when we were analyzing the self in previous chapters. We're not necessarily analyzing the self as this very interesting philosophical conception. What we're trying to analyze is our actual experience of the self. And this is important to point out because I think sometimes the hypothetical interlocutor will try to wiggle their way around the refutations by positing more weirder philosophical ideas of what they're trying to ground. And then you can actually even point out that those philosophical conceptions undermine our actual experience of what we're talking about, right? So when we're trying to refute the self, it doesn't matter if you come up with this weird philosophical idea of the self to refute, because that's not what's being refuted. What's being refuted is, when someone steals something from me, I get mad, like that core self. And it's the same thing here with time. We're not necessarily just analyzing some strange concept of time, like hypertime or some other philosophical time, but the actual experience of time that just the transitions moment to moment from past, present, and future. So just something I wanted to point out that I noticed as I was reading this whole text. As philosophical as it can seem, it's really about just interrogating those raw feelings of experience. So verse 4, in this manner, one would regard the remaining two cases. Thus one would regard best, worst, and middling, as well as singularity and so on. So this verse, I think, does a whole lot of work. It basically, I think with verse 1, 2, and 3, we have a very skeletal architecture of the way of organizing the structure of analyzing the three times in a particular combination. And verse 4 basically says that any of these combinations between the three times, analyzing whether or not they're mutually dependent or mutually independent, will result in the same refutations. And then Nāgārjuna, which is typical of him, will also say, now this triadic formation of the three times and the way that we structurally analyze them, this same structure applies to any other triadic conceptual matrix of mutually implicating terms. And one example he gives, and the examples he gives is best, worst, and middling. I guess best, worst, and like moderate. And singularity, duality, and plurality. I haven't done the actual work for this, but I'm assuming if you analyze if the three components of those matrices, of those three terms, if you analyze them the same way as we analyze time, we get to the same results. That we can't ground these relations in that way. And then the commentary says that Buddha Palita adds that the same reasoning would undermine the real existence of such pairs as near and far, earlier and later, and cause and effect, and so on. So it's nice to see that this sort of reasoning is not just applicable to triads, but also to dualistic pairs as well. Cool. So verse 5. A non-abiding time cannot be apprehended. An abiding time that can be apprehended does not exist. And how is a non-apprehended time conceived? So we should state at the outset here that here abiding time, it refers to unchanging time. So abide is unchanging, and non-abiding is changing. So I broke this verse into 3 parts. First is that non-abiding time cannot be apprehended. Then second is abiding time that can be apprehended does not exist. And then the last part is how is a non-apprehended time conceived. So for the first part, that a non-abiding time cannot be apprehended, we get the explanation that Buddha Palita gives in understanding this part of the verse, which is that only that which is fixed or settled can be measured. So a non-abiding time could not be measured. So a time which is sort of intrinsically changing without any sort of momentary static duration that we can actually delineate, then there's no way to actually sort of understand time. So since time can't be measured in that way, it sort of undermines our experience of time. So we can't say that there is a non-abiding time. The second part of the verse, an abiding time that can be apprehended does not exist. That says, so this suggests that if time can be measured, then it abides. But abiding time makes no sense, since again, time indexes the transition from the future into the present into the past. So a time which abides doesn't make sense. Because for example, the present, when we think about the now, right? The now we just thought of has immediately moved into the past. So there's a sort of innately momentary, almost durationless aspect to time.
Yeah. Getting later, the aspect of time as, there's actually something interesting. I wrote a paper about this recently that I kind of don't really buy the argument of this having much significance to the way people see the world. But one of the things that Sapir, the linguist who wrote about linguistic relativism, wrote about or thought was important is the fact that in Hopi, you can't actually use measuring words for time. All temporal relations are expressed in terms of laterness. So you actually can't say, we'll leave in 10 days. You have to say, we'll leave after the 10th day of staying here. that like they do have lots of measurement words like every language, right? To say, or like almost every language, there are like a few very minor exceptions, but like you could say 10 rocks, you can say like whatever 10 trees, but you can't say 10 days. You have to say the 10th day, as in like after one day passes, another one passes. And he says that this is a feature of Hopi that makes Hopi, like first language Hopi speakers, less deluded, according to him. I don't know if I really buy this, because you can say the exact same thing in English. So I don't really know it. Because he says that the real true in a weird way, he reifies the non-abiding time here by saying the true nature of the temporal experience is the getting laterness, not the chunks of measured time. He says that's what time really is, and that's why Hopi first language speakers are more in touch with the human experience of time than English first language.
Is this a new iteration of the noble savage?
I don't know. View? I mean, it could be. I just don't buy this, just because I think, from an ultimate perspective, both measured time and both abiding time that can be measured and non-abiding time that can't be measured, and it's just this feeling getting laterness, are both on an ultimate level conceptual proliferation.
Right.
And at a conventional level, in English, I can talk about both. So I don't really get how I'm impoverished by being able to talk about both.
Well, I think
if anything, it seems like Hopi is impoverished for not being able to talk about measured time. I don't know. But
yeah, I mean, I think there's something important that comes that brings us to this idea about why the Hopi might be better off, I guess, is that I think something about the conditions of their lived experience sort of, has co-arisen with this particular conception of time, right? Our conceptions of time. So if time doesn't ultimately exist, right, we can't ground any one particular scheme of time onto an ultimate ground. So where do we ground it? Instead, we may ground it on this sort of collective system of social practices and conditions that make it useful for that particular culture to have the kind of idea of time that they do. So rather than saying that the difference between Western time and Hopi time is based on who is more or less deluded about time, I think it says more about the respective cultures and how the civilization functions. Time is an incredibly important way of organizing what we do. So I think the differences in what we do and how we do it could translate also to differences in how we conceive of time. So I think that's the interesting part of that view, that there's more to the Hopi conception of time than just the conception. It says more about them as a whole. But again, I think what this more that it says, it just merely says that their time is dependent on their values and what they do. And so in a way, the Western time and the Hopi time is equally diluted, perhaps. Or possibly equally enlightened if it's positioned in the context of just being a mere convention. Yeah, so let's see. And so that the last part of verse 5, how is a non-apprehended time conceived? And the way I understand this is that we can say that there is a real yet fundamentally unknowable nature to time, but then that sort of doesn't make sense to us. We can make sense of time. We make sense of time a lot. We organize time all the time to do everything we do every day. So the idea of this weird mystical time that exists, but we can't really make sense of it and measure it, just starts to diverge from our real idea or our felt experience of time. And again, I want to point out here the strategy of the Madhyamaka to not only press the interlocutor to establish a point as well as they can, but also sort of police the interlocutor in making sure that they remain relevant and discussing an aspect of time that actually, is experienced. So these two things, I guess, that's happening with the Madhyamaka is sort of, don't forget what we're actually talking about, and this thing that we're actually talking about, how can you ground it? And so let's see. Yeah, so the one of the implications of verse 5 is that if time exists at all, whether abiding or non-abiding, it cannot exist ultimately. This can only be ways of speaking. So that's basically, that concludes the verses specifically about time itself being ultimately real. The incredibly tiny verse 6 will go over with a very broad stroke, the idea that time is convention, yet based on ultimately real things. And so verse 6 says, if time exists dependent on an existent, how will time exist in the absence of an existent? No existent whatsoever exists. How then will there be time? So this basically, we're pretty much a little bit over halfway to the book. And I think this basically goes on the back of the whole previous aspect of the text, which is basically saying that we went through all of these different categories of existential phenomena and concepts, and we've refuted them one by one. And so this should, at this point, you should have the sense that there are no real things that can serve as the basis upon which time can be imputed. So for example, we're refuting causes, refuting conditions, refuting the elements of experience, the ayatanas, bandhas, and dhatus, the desires, the conditioned, prior and posterior parts, the self, etc., etc. If you followed along this far, at this point, you should be at the point where you can't really ground time on something other than itself. So now that we've refuted time itself being inherently existent, we've also refuted the idea that it inherently depends on inherently existent things. So time is not real. Yeah, and so I think that basically concludes this session. Does anyone have any final comments? Cool. And really loved the discussions on the other topics too. It was really nice to get a more holistic sense of how to understand time from the Buddhist Madhyamaka point of view. For our next reading, is the analysis of an assemblage, and that's pretty long. I mean, it's only 14 pages, but it's pretty dense, I think. So there's a lot to talk about. So I think for the next weekend, hopefully, which I can do now that the holidays are pretty much over, unfortunately, we can do chapter 20. Does that sound good to everyone? Cool. So if no one has any additional comments, thanks for joining back after about a month of a hiatus.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye,
Have a good
everybody.
weekend.
Yeah. You too.